Okay, we now turn to a duo from Swiss Re. So we have two presenters. The first presenter is Alison, then. Alison Drill, who works for, as I said, Swiss Re. She works with property and casualty. Seemingly, it seems to be with sort of lots of non-traditional solutions, and she's currently head of P&C Structured Solutions Asia. And Asia and I don't know, isn't Australia, New Zealand part of Asia now?
Absolutely.
Oh, it's just Asia. And then, well, I'll introduce Cherie as well in the same time, so that you can just switch in when you want to switch. Cherie Gray is also with Swiss Re, has, from what I can understand, a quite different role. Works in the as global leader for sustainability and market development in the public sector area. So a completely different area of expertise. So it's going to be interesting to see how the two of you interrelate. Prior to joining Swiss Re, she has 13 years of experience in various primary insurance companies. Please.
Thank you. So what's nature positive, and why does it matter to actuaries? I think we're here to present the case about why we should be trying to embed nature positive actions into everything that we look at and do in terms of helping insurers, helping superannuation funds and investments, and indeed helping corporates to make infrastructure investment decisions. So we're going to talk about nature-based solutions, which are actions inspired by and supporting nature. It's also called natural capital, natural assets, and it really comes back to the fact that nature helps us generate income, it provides national wealth, it's important to social health and economic stability from the clean air that we breathe, the water that we use, the agricultural land we rely on for production, and inputs. So let's quickly take the case of mangroves. Mangroves are very important to anybody living on the coast and people living inland. Not only do they provide fisheries for people, villages living just inside the coast, they're actually extremely useful for preventing damage from tropical cyclones when they come inwards. They filter the water that comes down out of the rivers as well, and thereby also protecting the offshore fisheries and reefs. And they also support and capture carbon. They're an excellent carbon sink. But this comes down to the point that by and large, as a people, we've just been using them and not putting a value on them in terms of how do we actually protect and indeed restore and improve on the nature of natural capital. This is where actuaries can come in because we're very good at looking at both probabilities and longer term investment. So in terms of the economics behind this, I'll let you read some of the numbers on the board, but the first one really comes from this idea that it's very important to recognise the ecosystem values that exist in nature. More of half of the world's GDP is directly or indirectly dependent. The second number comes from a particular study, but it's been replicated a number of different ways, that in fact natural assets are very good at mitigating and helping with adaptation to natural disasters and the impact of climate change. And then the third number relates to the economic benefits that could be derived from investing into natural assets, developing, restoring, protecting. So everybody's going to benefit in some way, but as I already touched on, it's this idea that up till now, there really hasn't been a lot of valuation or thought given to those natural assets and the impact of them. Businesses need to identify and acknowledge the inputs and revenues that could be derived from natural assets, and then incorporating them into decision-making, such as infrastructure assets. Investors can also apply a lens to think about the value of natural capital and build that into their investment decisions, including the governance and measurement that would apply, such as we've already, I think, aware of TCFD. But what's coming right after it is TNFD, so the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures, where there will be measurements applied to investment and business decisions. Government and public sector is also responsible for protecting nature, and by recognising the dual role that private and public can play in protecting, restoring and conserving nature, we should significantly enhance the value of the assets and capital. This is an example of a framework that's now applied to what is a nature-based solution, or how to approach incorporating a natural capital framework into a business. So first of all, avoid. So stop harmful activities, stop actually destroying nature by incorporating it into a business decision-making process. Mentioned already TNFD, but there's also the Global Biodiversity Framework, which has now been passed late last year, for instance, with targets such as the 30 by 30, which is 30% of natural capital to be protected by 2030. Reduce and restore. So this idea of shifting practices and policies to limit the operational impacts and offsetting activities in order to build them into the business models. So examples there would be in New South Wales here, we have a biodiversity offset scheme, which actually, in order to encourage thoughtfulness, would look at actually requiring certain businesses to buy offsets in case they're actually also doing what's basically negative actions. Australian government is now working on the draft bill for the nature repair market as well, which will look more at additionality in terms of biodiversity credits. And then to transform, this is where we reach a nature positive state, and companies and governments start actually taking additionality, so actually improving the natural states that we're talking about. This also gives rise for us to define new products. How do we actually create insurance products that will help this improvement in the natural assets and ecosystems, such as green infrastructure and others? Green bonds is also a good example, but I'm not going to dwell too much on that. I think we'll get there, right? Impacts and opportunities. This is where the actuarial role can come in and be particularly important. So as mentioned, we're very good at assessing risks. So if we incorporate into that the framework of the loss of natural capital and assets, in the same way that we might look at the loss of a building, can we also look at the loss of mangroves that comes from a pollution event? Shouldn't we also be addressing this? When we're doing our cost-benefit analysis, we should also be incorporating the important values of natural assets into that. And we, as actuaries, should be well placed to look at the intergenerational and longer-term values. And with that, I'll hand over to Cherie to talk about case studies.
Okay, so, I mean, we've had a bit of theory this afternoon, so I'd like to wrap up with actually showing what we can do in practice, right? So what are some of the actions and realities of these concepts and theory, particularly when it comes to creating, nature positive action? So the first one, the first picture you can see up there is the Prince Hendrik Sand Dyke. So it is a lovely place in Texel Island in the Netherlands. And like most of the Netherlands, it's mostly underwater, right? So Texel Island is actually a World Heritage Site. It attracts about 1 million visitors a year. But it had an old concrete dike, which is at the risk of failure. So rather than actually reinforce the concrete dike, the local municipality looked for a more innovative solution because they knew that they had to do something because they need to protect, the island from the rising sea levels, but they also needed to protect, I guess, the environment and the community needs of the area. So what they did was they actually created a nature-based solution. They moved 5 million cubic metres of sand and planted 2 million marram grasses and created that gradient that you can see at the top. So it not only reinforced the dike as, a solid construction and reduced the erosion risk, but it also enhanced the local natural habitat. And the project also delivered an extra €1 million benefits in terms of fish production, climate regulation, and water quality regulation. So this project was done in 2019, and at the time it was one of the biggest dike reinforcements operations. And Swiss Re provided a construction or risk policy. It was necessary to, I guess, reduce the potential community and environmental impacts in the case of damages and a non-delivery. So the dredging company that actually carried out the operations was an existing client. So it just shows that there was, existing processes and risk management, but it meant that they were able to actually, take on this innovation, right, and think about how they could actually repurpose and broaden their core competencies. So this approach can be easily replicated and scaled, and it shows also how investing in nature can also help improve climate adaptation. And it also really demonstrates the transformative mindset of firstly, the municipal council that was actually open to an innovative solution, but secondly, the dredging company who actually created a new market for their capabilities in spurring nature-based solutions. So the second example is actually one that I guess is catalysing or developing a new market of biodiversity credits. So the example that we have is from Australia, which, as we know, is one of, the most species-rich and unique areas on the planet, but we also know that land clearing and introduction of foreign species has, left many of our own species vulnerable and on the brink of extinction. So Wilderlands is a company that is, I guess, has a long history of land management and conservation, but there's also a dependency on philanthropic and donation efforts for them to do their work. So to think of a new revenue stream, they actually have developed a nature-based credit system. And the land that they have is divided up into biological diversity units, right? These BDUs. And you can actually purchase these units, which then in turn fund the conservation and restoration work of that land. So there is some very strict eligibility criteria. There needs to be a degree of permanence, protection, supporting First Nations access, and also making sure that these activities are practical and adaptive. There's an independent third party that registers and tracks the transactions and certificates that actually issue sales. So it also leverages, what Alison was talking before about the compliance frameworks in place, where you have compliance offset markets. So when there's an infrastructure project or something like that that the government is funding, or public-private arrangements, there's actually projects that will offset that activity. So if we can actually take these frameworks and turn them into more voluntary activities, then it's actually creating a more nature-positive market. So the pricing of these units is, developed from, I guess, kind of first principles, cost plus. So what does it actually take to develop the project, to restore this land, and then creating the market is, I guess, something that we're watching very closely. But, as Alison said, there are new processes and approaches coming in, task force for nature-based related financial disclosures, global biodiversity framework, and as companies and also, public sector agencies start to assess and track, this is actually going to open up a new mechanism and investment opportunity for them. The last case study is on coral reefs and insurance for coral reefs. So in 2017, which is some time ago now, Swiss Re developed the first insurance for coral reef in Mexico. And there are now a few more insurance covers for additional coral reefs around the world, right? So essentially, we've actually catalysed and created a new market, a nature-positive market that's slowly, but nonetheless, growing, right? So the basic design here is a parametric storm cover. So it's triggered by wind speed moving through a defined location, and the payout covers the funds for restoration. There's actually teams in place that go out in the boats, collect the corals, reattach them, and the claim payout actually funds that activity. But the reason why this model has actually been effective is because it's been proven, right? So it's been able to demonstrate the benefits and since been replicated. So in Mexico in 2020, Hurricane Delta triggered an insurance payout, which was paid to the Quintana Roo government, so they were the policy holder. And this covered the cost of the teams that actually went out, they reattached the corals, they collected the fragments, because the research showed that the sooner you can actually, get in there, the sooner you can actually reattach the coral fragments, then the faster it will recover, right? And then the reef will actually come back to health very quickly. And in the case of Quintana Roo, this was actually really important, not just to manage the erosion risk that the reef protected, but also the tourist economy that was heavily dependent on all the reef-related activities. So in 2002, Hurricane Lisa came through Belize. So the product was actually replicated further down the coast and in Belize. And that actually triggered a similar payout. And in this case, the policyholder was the MAR Fund, so a conservation organisation. And they received the payout to then fund similar activity to actually collect and stabilise the coral fragments. And the model has since been replicated in Hawaii, and there's also programs in Southeast Asia exploring similar themes. So I guess to wrap up my call to action, we've presented the principles and the theories, but also the case studies of what actually can be done. But we need to leverage all the available skills, in particular the objective and the commercial, to mainstream these problems and solutions. It's not just the role of the NGOs, of the environmentalists. The public sector has, a lot of influence and action to do here, but we actually need the private sector to really help enable that. So firstly, we have to acknowledge the value that nature provides through the resilience, but also the revenue benefits. And then secondly, we need to enable significant and sustained investment in the nature and ecosystem services, which insurance can do and which the actuarial capabilities can help us. Because in order to do that, we need to have confidence in the valuation, in the risk assessment, standardisation of data, understanding the cost benefit, and really work in collaboration with the public sector and philanthropic actors. So we know that insurance is a tool that can actually, protect and enhance our biodiversity, but can also provide the fiscal stability, right? Particularly for economies that are very dependent on nature-related tourist activities and the protection activities. So to close, I just invite you to transform the mindset and help us join in the nature positive actions.